get started today. Thank you everyone for joining us for day 4 of retreat. It is Thursday and we have some great sessions for you today. This morning we're going to start off with Allison. She's going to be talking to you guys about how schools and communities use survey data to create change. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm so glad you guys could all join us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I think it's been a good week so far. I've really enjoyed it. I would love to introduce Allison Barden. She is currently the director of Madison Chatham Coalition. They serve the Madison and Chatham school districts, so they cover two school districts and 2 communities in New Jersey. Prior to coming to the coalition, Allison served as the Youth and Teen Development Director at the Madison Area YMCA, and so has a lot of experience working with youth and is doing a great job. She's going to be speaking about how they work with different partners to collect student survey data and to share some of their successes. So I'm thrilled to hear more about it. Thanks, Allison.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much, Kelly, and thanks, Jessica. So as Kelly said, my name is Allison Barden. I am the director of the Madison Chatham Coalition in Madison, New Jersey. We are located about 15 miles southwest of New York City. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our coalition, but here's today's agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about our coalition and the communities that we serve. I'll go through our data collection timeline. So just some historical events that we've had as they relate to data collection. I'll talk about quantitative and qualitative data and then just sort of put it all together. But I will say the student survey portion of this presentation is the biggest. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, but that's definitely the biggest section. So once we get through that, it'll a little bit lighter after that. So I just wanted to highlight some learning objectives. So things that I really thought as I was putting this presentation together were the most important things and the things that I've learned over the past 3 years in this role as director. So number one, capacity building is key. So for all of us that are here today, that our coalitions are funded by the Drug-Free Community Support Program grant, we know that we have 2 goals, right? So our first goal is to establish and strengthen community collaboration, and our second goal is to reduce substance use. And I think the first goal is number 1 for a reason. I'd say that as a coalition, Madison Chatham Coalition spends at least 75% of our time working to build capacity. And in order to build credibility, you have to start by building capacity. So that's definitely, I'll probably talk about that point on every slide throughout this presentation today. Number 2, communication is crucial. So as I started putting this presentation together and thinking particularly about our student survey process, I went back and started looking through all of our volunteer logs and our in-kind logs and everything. And I noticed, I started tallying up the amount of time. So we spent in excess of 60 hours taking meetings for our last student survey, which was administered in February of 2019. So those are meetings with school staff, superintendents, with Kelly from Epiphany and other Epiphany staff. So it's really important, it was very important for us to have our lines of communication open at all times. And that communication is so crucial. We all know that data is sensitive and the data collection process is very sensitive. So as coalition staff, we want to make ourselves available all the time to stakeholders during that process. Something else that I think is really important and to keep in mind is that each survey, and I wrote each survey, but I really mean each data collection piece is different. So each key informant interview that we've done is each one is very different, but each student survey really is a different process. And we think about this upcoming survey, so our coalition is slated to survey students again in the winter of this school year. Well, obviously this one is going to be incredibly different than any that we've done in the past. And I think it's important, I've learned that it's important to go into each student survey with that in mind, that it's not going to be exactly like the last one. And that's important, and you want that because you want the most updated data that's available so that we know which direction to move in as a coalition. And then lastly, each district, sector, and stakeholder is very different, right? So in Madison, we serve 2 distinct school districts, but they have very different, their process for how, the survey approval process is different. Their data sharing process is different. Everything is very different. And they should be treated as such. So it doesn't matter if you serve, if you're a county coalition and you're serving 30 school districts, or you're just serving 2 or 1. Well, 2, I guess, for comparison's sake. Everyone is different, and you have to take the time to get to know what is important to each district, as you're starting the student survey process. So before I jumped into the student survey, I wanted to kind of just throw out a poll, just for you to start thinking a little bit to yourself. And as we go through this presentation, which best describes your coalition? So number 1, our coalition is high functioning. We engage the community in the data collection and data sharing process. We're rock stars. Number 2, our coalition collects data, but we don't do much else with it. And then lastly, data, what's that? Well, I assume that since we're all part of this retreat and we all work with Epiphany, we know what data is, and they do a really good job of making sure that we're aware of what data is and aware of why it's so important. I just wanted everyone to think a little bit about where you think your coalition falls. I would say that for me, MCC falls somewhere in between 1 and 2, and we certainly strive for number 1, but sometimes it's difficult, it's easy to lose sight of why the data is so important because of how big a process it is to collect it, right, and then to share it. So we strive for number 1, but we're somewhere in between 1 and 2. So just some fast facts about the Madison-Chatham Coalition. So as I mentioned, we serve 2 communities totaling 35,000 people. So it's actually 3 municipalities though. There's Madison and then Chatham Borough. There's Chatham Borough and Chatham Township. Those 2 municipalities do come together in one school system, but there's different law enforcement and different government and different health departments in both of those municipalities. Like I said, 2 school districts totaling right around 3,000 middle school and high school students. We're in our 3rd year, ending our 3rd year of drug-free communities funding. We have right around 35 active adult coalition members, and then we have a teen task force that currently has 4 youth members. Our focus is on the prevention of underage marijuana and alcohol use. And one other thing that I wanted to add that I didn't include on this slide is that for those of us that are on this call today that live in New Jersey, we know that there are municipal alliances. So for everyone else, a municipal alliance is it's an organization that is focused on underage prevention, but also substance abuse prevention, and then also mental health. And these groups are funded at the state level. So as far as I understand it, New Jersey is the only state in the country to have these municipal alliances and then also DFC funded coalitions. So I'm bringing this up because I'll be talking about it throughout the presentation and our partnership with those groups. In Madison, there are 2 municipal alliances, one in Madison and one in Chatham, and they've been around for 20 or 30 years. So they're well established within our communities. So these are some important historical events that have happened just around the coalition, around data collection. So in winter of 2013, and this is before I was working with the coalition wasn't even established then, the Madison School District administered the Pride Survey for the first time. And a lot of us are familiar with the Pride Survey. It's a survey that collects information on substance use, and then also risk and protective factors. So like I said, I wasn't part of the coalition at that point. I wasn't part of the community, but from what I've heard from people that were, the district was not very pleased with that process, with the data collection process. So they were looking for something else. Chatham had not ever collected that data before. So in February of 2015, the Madison Chatham Coalition was founded, and really it was founded with an intent to apply for the DFC funding. In November of 2016, sort of as a way to strengthen our application, we administered the first student survey at the middle school and high school in Chatham. And we did that with input from the schools, and I'll talk more about that later. Then in September of 2017, I didn't include here, but we were funded. We received our funding from the DFC. In June 2018, we administered our first community survey with the help of Epiphany, and that was geared really towards parents. And then in February of 2019, we administered our second survey, our second round of the student survey. And that summer, we started completing key informant interviews and really more qualitative data collection. So that summer and that fall. And then now here we are, fall 2020, not really knowing what's happening in terms of being able to survey students again, but we are slated to go back in and survey middle school and high school students in the winter. So at this point in time, we're starting to very lightly, here and there, drop some hints about the survey with the schools, but we haven't had any real formal conversations yet. So the types of data that we collect, just like probably most everybody else on this call, in terms of quantitative data, we're doing student surveys, and then community surveys and parent surveys. And then for qualitative data, we are performing or conducting key informant interviews, listening sessions, focus groups, and then one other type of qualitative data that I did not include on this slide is anecdotal. So we're definitely using that as another source of data on our logic model. So I'm going to get into the student survey portion of this presentation, and like I said, it's a lot. So if you do have a question as I'm going, please just, you can put it in the chat box and so that, we don't miss anything. So I wanted to try and find a quote, which finding a quote on data collection is like not really easy. There aren't that many quotes about it, but I found this one and I thought it was really good in terms of quantitative data collection. So numbers have an important story to tell. They rely on you to give them a clear and convincing voice. Okay, so just some basics about our student survey. So as I mentioned, it was first administered in 2016. At that point in time, I was a member of the coalition. I was fulfilling the youth serving organization sector requirement. So I wasn't very involved in the process, but I was there for it. We completed our last round in 2019, so after we were funded, and it's completed at the middle school and the high school levels. All students 6th through 12th grade have the opportunity to take the survey. We don't sample once every 2 years. We have multiple, this past year, we actually had multiple funders contribute to the survey cost, and I'll get a little bit more into that, but we had the coalition, the municipal alliances, which I mentioned before, and then actually one of the school districts also paid a portion of the cost. And that's really important, obviously, for buy-in, to have that many stakeholders, that many people involved in the process. It just creates so much more ownership of the data once it's collected and of the process as well. So it's a custom design survey, and this is really important. So going into the survey, planning, those 60 hours that I talked about before, we learned very early on, Kelly and I actually together on a call with the student assistance counselors from one of the districts, we learned that one of the superintendents had very clear objectives in mind when he agreed to participate in this survey this past year. He was interested in collecting specific data on sleep patterns of students and then also how they felt about school safety. He was looking to change, he had objectives. He wanted to change the high school starting time, and he wanted to hire a class 3 officer, install a class 3 officer at the high school. And in order to get Board of Education approval for that, he really wanted to have the data to support it. So it just so happened that we were in a survey, we were required to be in a survey year. So that worked really well, where we could satisfy his needs and then also ours as well. So in addition to those questions, of course, we're asking as a coalition, we're asking our 4 core measure questions. And then also a lot of, it's very heavy mental health, student health and wellness portion as well. So these are just the key players. Like I said in that learning objective slide, Each district is very different. You'll see a C or an M next to each of those roles, just, if it's Chatham or Madison or both. So in both districts, the superintendent is the one who's ultimately deciding whether or not the survey will occur. Luckily, we have a good relationship with both superintendents. They've been to coalition meetings before. They know who I am, so it just makes things a little bit easier, which is great. In Madison, there's an assistant superintendent of special services, and he's the one who really takes meetings, decides on the survey logistics, and things like that. But he's still just sort of, not super involved, but more involved than the superintendent. He's the go-between. In both districts, we are so lucky to have the student assistance counselors that we do. We work with 4 student assistance counselors, and they're really the boots on the ground for this process. So they're the ones that are taking meetings. Those 60 hours that I mentioned before, they were in a lot of those meetings. They're really helping to design the content and helping to decide what the objectives are going to be. And then lastly, the alliance coordinators, the municipal alliance coordinators, and our board members. The municipal alliance coordinators in particular, because the alliances are contributing to the cost of the survey, they have to take it in front of their committees, and they have to get approval from their committee members for them to agree for the alliance to put money toward the survey. So they are so important. Our partnership with them it's so valuable. So just some logistics. So this first point is definitely, from what Kelly has said, I don't have too much experience outside of our community, but it's unique. It's definitely unique, this process. So something I didn't mention when I was talking about Madison and Chatham, they are both very high performing school districts in terms of academics. Chatham High School has been named the #1 high school in the state by our state magazine multiple times, I think most recently 2 years ago. So very high stakes when it comes to academics in particular. So in an effort to get as many students to participate in the survey as possible, so New Jersey is an active consent state, meaning that parents have to opt in, not just opt out from surveys. So to create more buy-in from parents, our student assistance counselors actually came up with the idea to use the online parent portal as a way to give information about the survey and then to gain consent as well. So what we do is every time that we administer a student survey, we do it in conjunction with the beginning or the end of a marking period. And in order for parents to access their students' grades via the online parent portal, when they go to do that, a letter pops up on their screen that talks about the survey. It's from the school district. It talks about the survey, talks about what the objectives are and what the questions are. There's a sample that's included. And then from there, from that screen, they have to either opt in or opt out, and then they can access their students' grades. So it's worked very well for us. I think that it's helped our response rate, but it's just showing that the district is taking ownership and they're behind this survey, and they're advocating for us that parents should say yes and allow their student to participate in the survey. So it's an online survey that's administered. This past year, it was administered in all English classes because English is a required curriculum for all of those grades. Students completed the survey on school-issued Chromebooks, and it was throughout various periods during the day, and it was just one day. So the actual survey taking, the process of students taking the survey, that's easy. That's one and done. It's the lead up that's the harder part. And then, like I said before, the alliances, the coalition, and the schools all contribute to the survey cost. So the coalition pays for the graphical reports, comparison reports, all of that. The municipal alliances, they paid for the cost of the actual survey. So within their district that they serve, how many students actually took the survey. And then the schools, I mentioned before that the superintendents had their own objectives. In one of those districts, like I said, he was interested in changing the start time of the high school and also hiring the class 3 officer. So he was interested in correlating that data between students' sleep and then mental health and substance use. And he wanted to run cross tabulations on that data. Because that was a little bit outside of the scope of what the coalition could do, he was totally fine with covering the cost of that because it was very important to him. So now we've collected the data, and then it's time to actually share the data. So what we did for the first time in 2019, after we collected the data, was our coalition actually hosted a closed meeting. We invited the superintendents and the student assistance counselors, and then also the municipal alliance coordinators. We had Kelly Keck fly out and give a presentation. We had binders with their individual districts' information in it, and then the combined data. So because the Madison-Chatham Coalition, of course, serves both districts, in that meeting, Kelly only spoke to the combined data. And we do that because they're competitive districts, they're right next to one another, and we serve both. We never want to pit one district against the other when we're serving both. We don't want one district to say, well, look, one presenting to parents or presenting to the Board of Ed, we don't want them to say, look, our 30-day marijuana use is so much better than Madison's. I mean, look at what's going on over there. We don't ever want to do that. So Kelly in that meeting just shared the combined data, and then she actually offered each district individual virtual sessions to go through their individual data points. So that was very effective. What we had then after that, the student assistance counselors in Chatham, they took it from there, which is so great. They're the ones that, this is the second year that they've done it, they're the ones that are presenting their findings to the Board of Education. They are creating their own presentation. They're pulling out their most important data points that they feel is important to share to the with the Board of Education. And for me, and for our coalition, to have student assistance counselors that are so willing to stand in front of this data and to take ownership of it and show how it's important to them, it's so important. It's really fantastic, and we love that. At the coalition level, 1 month later, I gave an in-depth review, again, just of that combined data. And we had parents, we definitely have a larger turnout for that meeting. But again, I presented only on the combined data, and Madison and Chatham combined. And that was compared to national averages, just to give our members sort of an idea of what's going on in our community as it relates to the country. In Madison, the assistant superintendent was supposed to share the findings at a State of the Schools address as part of a Board of Education meeting this past April, which is a lot later. We administered the survey in February. He was looking to share the data in April, which we wish it was a little bit sooner. But unfortunately, that never happened as a result of the schools moving to an all virtual platform in March. The other great thing I want to mention, at least one of the districts, is they put the survey report from Epiphany right on their website. They are fully transparent with their data, and they encourage people in that board meeting that the student assistance counselors shared at. They encouraged parents to look at it, to go through the report and see what's going on. So that's really great. So then how does this data create change? We've had a lot of really great things come from the sharing of the data. So in particular, the hiring of additional counseling staff. So the survey that was administered in 2016, like I mentioned before, students are responding to questions about mental health, in particular suicide, self-harm. And when the student assistance counselors were preparing that presentation to the Board of Education, they noticed that students' responses around self-harm and suicide did not correlate to the number of risk assessments that they were performing at the middle school and high school. In other words, more students were responding on this survey that they were considering self-harm or suicide than the student assistance counselors were seeing and were being able to perform risk assessments on. So they didn't like that. They didn't feel that they had the capacity to meet the needs of students. So they went in front of the Board of Education, they shared this data, And as a result, they were able to hire an additional student assistance counselor who is now a coalition member. So every time I see her, I think, well, it's a good thing we collect this data. It's very important. So that was a really positive change and that benefits the district. The installment of the Class 3 special officer. So as I mentioned before, we had a survey question this past year that assessed school safety. And, at that point, the Class 3 officer had already been installed, but now the superintendent can use this data to say, look, students feel safer with this officer here, and they have the data to support it. Going back to that first point, one of the schools was able to implement a suicide prevention curriculum based on student responses. And then one thing that they're still working on is a potential later starting time at the high school. So that could come, that could be a positive change that comes from this data as well. So for me, and Kelly knows this, the student survey in particular, we all know it's a very stressful process. It's one that I kind of dread each time it's a survey year, and we've had successes, but we've certainly had challenges also. So some of the successes that we've had, I think garnering the trust and partnership of each school district, it's paramount. There's nothing, they're the keepers of all of the teens and all of the parents in our communities. And those are two powerful groups, and they're the ones that we're trying to reach. So if we're partnering with the schools, they're giving us access to those populations, and it's so important. We're lucky to have a pretty good response rate. That's definitely a success. And then, as you saw from that last slide, these districts are using the data to create positive change, and that benefits everybody. So that's 100% a success. Challenges. So I know that I included on that first slide that we want districts to have distinct objectives, and that makes it a more robust survey. But sometimes we found that those objectives differ so much from ours as a coalition. We're just required to ask about the core measures. And sometimes, it's difficult to rein everybody back in and remind everyone that we don't want a 50-question survey that, that's off-putting to students. So sometimes it's just a matter of reining everybody back in. Also, the survey approval process is very different for each district. And in our area, Madison and Chatham, it's they're 2 miles away they're so close. Demographics are very similar. So you would think that the process would be the same, the data sharing and then also the approval process, but it's very different. So that's something that's a challenge for sure. That's something that we have to work around a lot of times. And then, one of the things that we don't have too much control over is the active consent. So unfortunately, it's just something that we manage and we do the best that we can. And luckily, again, the schools help with that piece. So that's the student survey. I know that's a lot of information to go through. The rest of the presentation is definitely not as cumbersome as that. But I do also, the student survey is important, but it's not the only type of data that we collect. So I wanted to touch on these other pieces as well, because they've all helped to create change in our community. So the community survey, our community survey is definitely geared towards parents. So it's administered at community events and then also at any other events that we as a coalition host. So in Madison and Chatham, we have 2 large festivals twice a year. So they draw upwards of 30,000 people. And as I mentioned before, our communities are only a total of 35,000 people population-wise. So these are large scale events we're able to do. We're able to collect a lot of data at those events. The questions that we ask aim to pinpoint root causes. So we're looking, specifically at ease of access, parent perceptions, consequences, things like that. It's a very short survey that we developed with the help of Epiphany. So it's 4 questions, it's a Likert scale, and it's paper and pen. And I don't know if you can see it on that picture to the left. It doesn't look like it's on that table, but we just have a ballot box just for privacy. And we incentivize survey responses. So coalition branded giveaways, gift cards, things like that. One other thing that I didn't include is that the guy that's standing there in the blue shirt, he is a teen that we work with in our teen task force. So we've found that it's so much more effective to have teens asking adults to complete these surveys. They're just less likely to say no for some reason to a kid with a smiling face than me or an adult volunteer. So that's been effective as well. So once we've collected this community survey data, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we share it. So we do this a lot at our capacity building meetings. So when we're looking to recruit additional partner organizations or additional members, we're always sharing this community data. It's always like the wow factor, you know, because we're asking questions about, you know, do you know of other parents that use marijuana in front of their children or with their children? Do you know parents that provide alcohol to their children? So when we share that data, it definitely, you know, it's like I said, it's a wow factor. So we've done this at interfaith council meetings, Chamber of Commerce, Elks, Rotary. That's like our primary audience. We also share this information at coalition meetings. We're always sharing this because it's helping our members stay connected to our mission and to our cause. And it really reinforces the need for the coalition in the community and, you know, the need for these people to stay on as members. And then lastly, we share this information via infographics and other, you know, any rack cards that we create, any brochures. We're including the data there. We find that coalition branded visual tools are helping this quantitative data come to life a little bit. And our community members and our stakeholders, they're able to feel more connected to the cause when they see their data from their community included. So we find that to be effective. So some changes that we've seen as a result of this data, the community survey data. Well, of course, we have a stronger logic model. You know, by collecting this data from parents multiple times a year at any event that we have, it allows for a constant updating and changing of our strengthening of our logic model. So that's really important. We've been able to implement parent programs, events, speakers, things like that, that really enhance skills and provide support. So, you know, we take that first picture is from a Hidden in Plain Sight that we hosted a couple of years ago. We've done it since then, but this was the first one. And when we talked to the DEA agent who presented, and we asked our local law enforcement to be engaged as well, that was very important. We wanted the local piece for Hidden in Plain Sight because we didn't want a DEA agent to come in and just have it be this abstract information where parents could sit there and say, well, not in my community. We had law enforcement there because they were able to say, oh no, it is in our community, and that's why we're hosting these events. So that was very, very important, and we used that community survey data in that setting. We launched a podcast series this year, again, taking information that we're learning from this community survey and making sure that our podcast series, our topics, are highlighting what parents want to learn more about or don't feel like they're educated on, you know, and they do want to learn more about it. So we're able to do that as well as other targeted activities. We've been able to recruit additional stakeholders with missions that are aligned to the coalitions. That's very important. You know, the more, just speaking to sustainability, the more community groups that are part of our work, the better. And because we're sharing this community data at these meetings, you know, when we go to recruit these groups, our capacity has increased. And that, you know, that's a direct result of collecting this data and sharing it. So that's very important as well. And then lastly, you know, we feel, we just had a coalition meeting yesterday, and actually one of the things that we talked about is how connected do our members feel to the mission and vision of the coalition as we wrap up our third year. And, you know, a lot of people said we feel more connected now more than ever. And that's because it's an environment of sharing and you know, really sharing data as we learn it. It just is so important to us. So it's really increased membership, or our members' pride and ownership in our mission. So that's quantitative data. I'm going to talk just briefly about qualitative and our process there. again, I found a quote, shockingly, about qualitative data. So effectiveness comes from those qualitative things that give you the ability to network, communicate, and lead people toward an outcome that they can't see. So I think qualitative data, in my opinion, it's kind of the meat and potatoes of the data that we're collecting. So it's really telling it's telling more of a story, I think. So it's crucial. So the types of data that we collect, probably just like all of you on this call, we're collecting key informant interview data, listening sessions, and then anecdotal data as well. So the key informant interviews, we're interviewing members, sector representatives, stakeholders. This last round of key informant interviews that we conducted, we interviewed all 3 juvenile detectives from local law enforcement. We interviewed mental health clinicians. We interviewed the teen director at the Y and other Y staff, actually. You know, we interviewed any key informant that was willing to share their what information they had. We do these, we conduct these interviews roughly every year, maybe every 18 months, but we want to do it frequently because then we can update our logic models and pinpoint effective coalition strategies. So very important. Listening sessions, we do a little bit less frequently. So we're targeting youth groups, our teen task force, parents, teens. We have a lot of really strong youth groups in the area. So we're engaging those leaders as well as the teens that are engaged there. We're doing it roughly every 2 years. We try and time it to be done in conjunction with the student survey. So like I said, we administered the student survey in February of 2019. And then we completed this last round of listening sessions in the fall of 2019. And then anecdotal data. So we're taking anecdotal data from anybody really that's willing to share. So guests at coalition events that aren't necessarily coalition members, speakers that we've had, members themselves, and we're collecting at any time. You know, if I'm on a phone call with a member or a board member, or anybody looking to recruit somebody and they have a piece of information that they think is important that we haven't ever heard before, of course we're going to cross-check that and see if anyone else has heard the same thing. But really this anecdotal data, it too makes a richer logic model, but it also gives us leads on potential key informant interviews, and then also potentially new data to focus on. We want to hear what the community is saying so that it can direct us as a coalition. So that's really important as well. So these, especially that last point, the anecdotal data, it seems like it's so small, right? But from these small conversations, we've actually been able to see some big change, and that this is all qualitative. So at the high school level, and then also at Project Community Pride, which is a no-fee counseling service that is part of the Madison Area YMCA. And I'm just going to mention too, the Madison Area YMCA is actually our fiscal agent. So we're lucky to have a very close relationship with them. But they adopted a life skills curriculum, and that was based on information that we learned from key informant interviews with law enforcement and social workers. We were able to launch new programming for teens. So after we conducted a listening session with teens last November, we learned that a lot of their peers were, if they were participating in, if they were drinking or using marijuana or anything like that, a lot of times it was happening directly before games, so in that pre-game time. So what we ended up doing was taking that information, going to the Y and saying, hey, we want to host some events just for that period of time, that pre-game time. And we ended up being able to do that. So launching some teen scene programming during that pre-game time. So it gave teens something to do. Also from that listening session with youth, we really asked them a lot of questions about the best way to reach them and their peers. We learned that hashtags aren't really effective anymore. So because of that, we were able to launch a townwide social norms campaign, Make Good Choices. And we were able to engage more teens in that process. We wouldn't have learned, that we couldn't reach them via Instagram, using hashtags if we didn't have that interview. So that was very important. And then lastly, we've been able to have informative workshops for teens and parents. So in particular with our parent listening session, we learned that there were a lot of information gaps, in particular around how marijuana has changed over the past 20 years. And with, just giving them some more information about edibles and the potency of marijuana, we learned that they really didn't know too much and they wanted to learn more. So now when we have events, we always have Fatal Vision goggles at our tables, and we talk about that with parents. We try and educate parents more on what has changed around marijuana and why it's so different than what they used, potentially when they were their kids' age. So again, we wouldn't know this if it weren't for these listening sessions that we're conducting. So all of this data is so important for us to collect, but even more, it's so important for us to share it with the community. So this is the last slide. I just wanted to go back to the learning objectives, just to make sure that I touched on everything. And I think the capacity building is key. Like I said, I think I probably talked about that more than anything else. In order to build credibility, you start by building capacity. It's so, so important. It's not, in our action plan, building capacity is not something that's stagnant. It's not something that, we write into our action plan at the beginning of the year and then we never look at again. We spend more time on that than anything else. Communication is crucial. We have to make ourselves available to stakeholders. We have to make ourselves available to anyone that wants to share any information about what's going on in our community. There's a reason that we engage 12 plus sectors of the community. It's because these are the groups that know the issues going on best. So we want to hear from them and we want to make ourselves available to them. Each survey is different. I think I definitely covered that. No two surveys are ever exactly the same, and we don't ever want them to be, because we want our coalition to be completely data driven. That is our objective. That's our goal. And in order to do that, we want to be collecting new data so that every action that we take is guided by data. So each process is different. And then lastly, each district, sector, and stakeholder is different. So, we're supposed to serve or supposed to engage 12 sectors of the community, but I never like to stop there. I think that it's more important to, like I said earlier, engage as many people as possible. It just makes, a much more high functioning coalition, and it makes that data collection process more engaging, and it makes more people feel connected to that process. And from that's where we see these really positive changes within our community. So with that, that's all that I have. So I'm gonna stop.
Yes, there is some questions in the chat. You want me to read them out to you, Allison?
Sure.
All right, so the first one we had was from Marietta. Is the survey that you do in addition to the statewide survey or instead of?
So this is the only survey that our two school districts are taking in regard to substance use.
Awesome. The next question was from Colleen, and she said, does the DFC accept your survey of more than just the 8th, 10th, and 12th graders every 2 years?
Yeah. Yep. So we submit all of the data 6th through 12th graders.
Awesome. And then Ellen had the question, were findings shared with students and kind of using them and telling that story?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Were findings shared with students?
Oh, are we sharing our findings with students? Yes, sorry. Yes, we are. So we do that we use our teen task force members to do that. We really have them be the ambassadors for that. But we have not engaged our schools to do that. That's not something that we've done before. I do like the idea of our student assistance counselors maybe taking ownership of that and in some way trying to get that information in front of them. That's a really good point, actually, that you brought up. I think, when the superintendent talks to parents at that Board of Education meeting and talks to the Board of Ed and shares about the student survey, he encourages parents to go through this data with their children, not just for them, but for their students as well, just to sort of see, here's what's happening. That social norms campaign that we talked about, we're in the process of really trying to highlight the positive numbers. Not everyone's doing it, and really pull out those data points. It's just a point of engaging the schools in that process as well.
Awesome. And I think, and if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to keep putting them in the chat. Jack also had the question, with the schools still in virtual mode right now, have you started the process for this year, or do you think it's better to wait and see what direction the schools are taking and take their lead?
So Kelly and I have talked about this. Kelly Keck and I have actually talked about this most recently a couple weeks ago. My approach right now is we actually just had an issue, just like so many, I'm sure, of you all are seeing in your districts around the country, where our high school actually had a confirmed case, which it blossomed really quickly. It ended up being traced back to a back to school party. And right now the number stands at around 30 high school students that are infected. So they moved all virtual just last week. They actually had only been in school for 2 days and they moved virtual. So with that being said, knowing all that they're dealing with right now, we're kind of taking a hands-off approach. At our coalition meeting yesterday, actually, I did just kind of like pepper into the meeting, oh, we're coming up on a survey year, but I'm trying not to be too in their face about it. But we could be in a situation this year where schools are more interested in collecting data from their students and learning more about mental health and substance use as a result of what's going on in the country. So, it's something that we're definitely, the timeline that Kelly and I spoke about is by November, really starting to lay some groundwork for that, but we're open, we're kind of hands off right now.
Awesome. I think that's a great way of putting it, for sure. I'm not seeing any other questions come in the chat. Oh wait, we do. We have Ellen had another one. Have you ever utilized a very current event in the school for data collection, or is counseling only needed at that point? I don't know if
So if I'm understanding the first part of the question, we partner with the schools on things like hidden in plain sight. When they have a consortium event that the student assistance counselors put together, they do 5 a year. So if we're part of that process, we are collecting data at those. So we're doing, it's not student data though, so it would be parent data. So we are, anytime we have an event, we have an evaluation form. It's a 2-sided form actually. So an evaluation of the event is on one side and then the parent survey is on the other side. So we put those on all the chairs before people sit down, and it definitely helps to ensure that people think that they're required to do it, which is nice because then we reap those benefits. So anytime there is an in-person event, we are collecting those parent surveys, but students aren't necessarily part of those, so we wouldn't be collecting student data there. I hope I answered that question.
I think so. Jackie said, for the community survey, did you say if you had a certain goal of the number of surveys you wanted to collect?
I mean, we don't go into it with, we want to collect X amount. They are pretty large scale. Like I said before, they're pretty large scale events. I think at our last one, so all of these events that I mentioned, those big town events obviously have been canceled for this year. We also, if we're tabling at a farmer's market, National Night Out was rescheduled for actually next week. So that could be, or 2 weeks from now. So that could be an opportunity for us to collect some community surveys. We typically, I think at our big, like Fishwack last year, that big Chatham Festival, we probably collected, somewhere around 100, maybe a little bit more than that, surveys. So, but we don't ever, we don't put a number on it necessarily. Whatever we get, and we're happy with.